work at a summer camp as a janitor of sorts. The camp is situated on a secluded island, so there's no flowing water and no electricity outside of the main small town. I live there during the summers, maintaining the facilities and cleaning up after the kids. Boring, I know. But the pay's fair, and I don't have to do much. And the only time I ever met a group was the first year the camp was held in 20 years. It was the summer of 2002, late in August.
It was a hot summer, and the group was very large. To celebrate the last night of camp, some of the oldest had snuck out, silently moving through the palm trees to escape watchful eyes. It was the middle of the night, and the moon was high in the sky, shining with a pale light, making the soft waves sparkle with life. By chance, they had set camp just outside of my cabin. The noise from their speakers and their shouting woke me from a drowsy, alcohol-induced sleep. I dressed to find them dancing and drinking by a blazing fire.
I brew a pot of coffee and waited for them to leave so I could peacefully go back to sleep. About an hour passed, and their shouting and dancing had quieted down. The music faded away, and the fire was less fierce, but still burning hot and red. I could see most of them gathering by the flames, speaking softly. Great, I thought. I could finally go back to sleep. But alas, two of the older girls, maybe 15 or 16, approached the cabin. One of them wore a flower-patterned bikini and the other a pale summer dress. It was hard to discern its color in the darkness.
The one in the bikini approached my door, while the other girl hesitated and stayed a few feet back. I went up to the door and opened it just before she had the chance to knock on it. She shrieked a loud, high-pitched shriek that only a teenage girl can make. The sound made me grit my teeth. She almost fell backwards, but her friend caught her, and the both of them began to giggle.
We thought this was the Ropemaker's house, the one in the dress said, smiling shyly. We didn't think anyone actually lived here.
Well, I'm only a janitor, I said, pausing to yawn, still tired and sleep-deprived. The legend of the Ropemaker was just a story we used to tell children. It was about morale, work ethics, and how dedication would lead to success. I vaguely remembered the story from my own youth.
Do you know anything about the legend of the Ropemaker? The girl in the bikini asked with a childish curiosity.
I frowned at her. Why were they asking about this? I was getting impatient, wanting nothing more than to lie back down in my bed and read.
Maybe I do, maybe I don't. Sure, I lived here about 30 years ago, but I was only a kid a few years younger than you girls.
What do you know about the Ropemaker anyway? I asked in an irritated tone.
Only that he died horribly, said the one in the dress. They say that he was drowned here. The other continued.
Would you tell us? They both asked eagerly, almost skittish. Pretty please? The girls pleaded, looking at me with big, hopeful eyes.
After a deep sigh, I agreed, and they took me by my hand and almost dragged me to the fire. The girls shouted at their friend to quiet down. Teenagers of all shapes and sizes were staring at me, sitting around the fire. An older boy stood. He was smoking a cigarette, but threw the butt into the sand and began arguing with the girls, saying that the old man was not welcomed at their party. The girls would have none of it, and made him sit down like the rest and keep his big mouth shut.
They were all waiting for a story. I could tell by the look in their eyes that they were not expecting a story about morale and duty. They were waiting for a horror story. And so I decided to tell a story so terrifying that none of them would ever return to disturb my peace again. So you want to know about the Ropemaker? I asked in a hushed voice. Most of them nodded or agreed, but some of them looked away like they didn't care at all.
I warn you, I almost whispered now. It is not a story for children. Are you sure about this? Just tell your story, old man, the older boy said in a nonchalant tone that implied that he was not going to be frightened by some janitor's ancient story. I almost felt sorry for them, but nevertheless, I began telling my story.
The legend began 30 years ago in a small village that used to be right here on this very island. The villagers had been living in fear for years and years. never leaving their houses alone or daring to sleep without their doors locked and bolted, fearing they might never wake again. For there was a serial killer amongst them. A wolf had made his way into the herd, and the herd was beginning to thin. No one trusted their friends, colleagues, or neighbors. Both girls and boys alike would be found hanging by their necks from palm trees, their corpses mutilated. The mutilation varied each time. At first the killer would take a finger or a toe, maybe an ear, but as he grew bolder he took eyes, nipples, or genitals. He always kept the parts for trophies.
So who was he? The girl in the dress asked. I'm getting there, I replied. Just let me tell the story. The bodies would always be found hanging from a tree beside the ropemaker's house, I continued. The villagers grew suspicious of the ropemaker, but could not prove he was a killer. After 3 years and over 50 murders, the desperate and fearful mayor decided to act. The island had become infamous for its serial killer, and tourists no longer came. He decided to sentence the ropemaker, who was just an old man who in day and day out worked on his ropes. He was seemingly harmless, and all agreed he was the kindest old man. But something had to be done. Someone had to pay.
They arrested him and tortured him for weeks, trying to get a confession, but to no avail. Between his screams he would plead his innocence, but they would not listen. In their last attempt to make him confess, they tied his feet to a rock with rope he was forced to make. Then they carried him out to the beach, just by the edge of the water, and buried the heavy rock in the soft sand. To confess or slowly drown by the inevitable tide were his only options now. The entire village came to see the killer confess. They even forced the ropemaker's son to watch him as the father would tear at the rope with his nails, ripping them apart. The old man would cry for help, for mercy, but when no one answered, he shouted curses at them. He threatened and screamed, he pleaded and begged, but no one answered his cries. The hours passed and the water slowly rose. Desperate to escape, he tried to bite off his own foot. He would scream between bites, tearing away at the flesh and tendons. However, he could no more get through his bone than he could the rope. In a last attempt, he tried to break his bone with his hands, but he could not do it, for the pain was too great.
His terrifying screams of agony and despair can be heard to this day. If you listen closely at night, you can hear it in the distance. He was drowned and buried right here, under the water right beside us. The moon was high and full that night, too. The ropemaker made the rope that would be his death with as much care and pride as all the others he had made before. And it would not budge or tear, no matter how hard he struggled. As the sun finally set, all the villagers were crying for the old man, ashamed of themselves for what they had done. Women and men, children and old people all cried for the man and for themselves. The killer had not been found. The only one who didn't cry was the ropemaker's son. He just sank to his knees and stared out at the horizon, eyes empty and cold.
Even though the man had never confessed, the murder seemed to have stopped. So the ropemaker was the killer? A younger boy with big black eyes asked. No one knows, I answered. Wow, that was a great story, said the boy who at first had argued. Let's go take a midnight swim, he shouted to the group. Many of the other kids started to rise to follow him. Wait, I almost shouted. They all instantly stopped at the loudness of my voice and sat back down. Don't you want to know how the story ends?
They all nodded. The fire was almost out at this point. Just an orange glow remained. I continued my story. Months passed, even years without any sign of the killer. Soon the world forgot about the incident, and the summer camps began again. They thrived for a couple of years until something happened during the last summer camp before this one. What happened? Someone whispered softly.
The last camp before this one was 20 years ago. and about 10 years after the Ropemaker's death, the mayor who had sentenced the Ropemaker had retired and his children were taking part in the summer camp as counselors. Since it was the 10th year of camps, they decided to make it bigger and moved it further away from the village. To celebrate the last day of the last week, a feast was held right where we are sitting right now. A giant bowl of punch was brought out by the fire. Food and drink shared between happy teenagers just like you. Even the counselors took part in the drinking. Happy shouting and joyful music could be heard late into the night. Little did they know what gruesome fate awaited them. The next day the sun rose and the sun set without any of them returning. The mayor, worried for his children, decided to walk out to the beach where the feast had been held. What he found drove him mad. It is said that he simply continued walking into the sea to drown his sorrow and his life.
It took yet another day for the locals to find the scene, and it was so terrifying the entire village abandoned the island within the year. Hanging from a tree, one rope tied to each limb like a marionette, was the mayor's daughter. Her head had been cut clean off. It was found by the beach, sitting on a pile of rocks, beside a corpse so mutilated it was no longer considered human. Arms and fingers twisted in cruel torture, and his entire body was covered in stabs and cuts. His face was the worst of it. His eyes had been gouged out, and then someone had poured acid into them, burning his entire face beyond recognition. On his forehead, carved all the way down to the bone, was the text, "Mutilator." All the locals who'd been working as counselors were tied, hand behind their backs with a thick rope in their mouths. Their kneecaps smashed and broken, unable to move by themselves. They had been left there to watch the waves crashing against them, just barely reaching their feet. When they'd been found, they were all sent to the hospital in the town. None of them ever spoke of what they had been forced to witness.
Later they found the corpses of the participants on the beach, tied to rocks and drowned by the tides. Most of them had been eaten by fishes, but some had clear bite marks on their legs just above where the noose had been tied. The locals say it was the spirit of the Ropemaker who did it. Others claim it was the gods. No one remains who lived through that incident. Most of the counselors who survived died soon thereafter from infections or dehydration. The few that lived later committed suicide by hanging. They never found the Ropemaker's son. He vanished the day of the incident, never to be seen again for 20 years.
And now the legend has almost been forgotten. Maybe someone needs to remind the world again. As I finished my story, I looked around. No one spoke for a minute. Nothing but a soft rustling of leaves and the nearby waves gushing against the beach. I could see the terror on their faces. They would not be swimming this night, and probably not for many nights to come.
I slowly stood, the soft glow from the burnt-down fire slowly dying. I drew in my breath and exhaled as hard as I could right at the ashes. Smoke rose and that little light that had been remaining faded in an instant. In the pitch of black darkness, girls and boys screamed and ran in all directions. I just stood there, laughing like a maniac. And that's the story of how I'm not allowed within 500 yards of any summer camp activities.